So for those of you tuning in now on the recorded version, you'll have to trust me when I say there's been 21 minutes of fabulous content that you did not hear. So I was about to talk about this ad on the pandemic, the Frito-Lay ad. If I could see you, I would ask you to nod and say, have you seen this ad? I will just show it to you in flash form since I don't want to show you the video. The ad starts with, it's a bunch of series of black screens with words on them. Things are hard right now. The next frame, the world doesn't need brands to tell us how to think or feel. The world needs brands to take action. Followed by, that's what we've been focused on at Frito-Lay. We're not, and at that point in the ad, they run some video of stuff they're putting money into around first responders and whatnot related to the pandemic. And then they come back to the black screens. We're not changing our logo. They say, this is not about brands. It's about people. And of course, the closing screen, but we are a brand, and here's our brand. Now, did you like that ad? A lot of marketers did. Ace Metrics is a sort of a marketing analytics outfit. They called that ad titled "It's About People" the best of COVID advertising. They evaluated it on their massive wheel of emotions and found it hit the appropriate emotional buttons for them, powerful, inspiring, and such. It is an ad that gets your notice. But not everybody, well, some were more cynical. An editor for Fast Company said, well, it's an anti-brand manifesto, but let's face it, it's still a commercial. This writer is saying, you know, what's interesting is they doll up the message as this kind of almost ad shaming of other brands, scolding them for being so gauche as to advertise in the middle of a pandemic, which of course is exactly what Frito-Lay is actually doing. Now, if we think about, instead, that's a COVID example. If we think about how firms have been communicating around racial justice and policing and such, a lot of it has looked like this. I've picked out Warby Parker here. It's just a more or less random selection of a form of communication I thought was typical. This Instagram post they did. You can read it. I'm not going to read it to you. I'll take a drink of water while you're looking at it. It's pretty typical, expressing a sort of a corporate form of emotion, stating some values, in fact, using there the word values, commitment, promising some money and some other actions to come and such. A clever sort of artist and critic with a cynical mind posted this attempt at a kind of a generic version, I guess almost satirizing this kind of corporate communication. We at Brand, fill in the brand here, committed to fighting injustice by posting images to Twitter with this solemn white on black JPEG that expresses vague solidarity, but will quietly elide the specifics of what's wrong or what's going to change. We hope this action encourages you to view our brand positively without, expecting anything from us. Okay, that's fairly cynical. But it is, I think it's a legitimate question about why, we know why firms want to engage in these forms of communication around both of these issues. But what do they really have to say, and what are the dangers? As a business writer at The Atlantic, I think, making a very good point that while American brands may be rushing to show where they stand on these issues because they feel they need to, they must, perhaps out of conscience, perhaps out of a need to strategically protect their brands. And I think a lot of this is Me Tooism, just mimicry. Some companies see other companies doing it and figure they must as well. I'm on a couple of nonprofit boards where we've had conversations about the degree to which, should we be releasing a statement because every other nonprofit has, even though the nonprofit board I'm on has really nothing to do necessarily directly in terms of its mission with either issue. And as this writer says, American brands have to show where they stand, but it's uncertain what they can offer other than this awareness of their existence and vague sense of virtue. Does that notion of virtue signaling by corporations Is it acceptable? Is it problematic? Um, there's certainly been a lot of attention to these messages. You know, you look at these headlines here. Corporate America says, you know, yeah, look at yourselves. Employees are skeptical. BLM posts are cute, but we want to see change. And I think this is a very interesting contrast between BLM, racial justice on the one hand, and coronavirus on the other. We have seen corporations wanting to communicate empathetically in both cases, but I think there's much more of this pushback, of course, on this side of those two issues. I don't think there was nearly so much cynicism directed at companies because they chose to be publicly empathetic on coronavirus. And I think that difference is interesting and important. Now, what some do is want to take companies and tell them, well, it's not just that we're cynical about your devotion to these issues, but you're actually hypocrites, for crying out loud, or you know, your words and your deeds are very inconsistent. Here you see the ACLU calling out Amazon for saying, well, that's great that you think that, but maybe you should stop selling facial recognition technology that is part of problems of police abuse. AOC with, you know, I suppose you could call it low-hanging fruit when the Washington Redskins did a Blackout Tuesday post, and AOC's retort pretty acerbic. Ripped from the headlines, this is just in the papers this morning. Walmart has been being called out in recent days and weeks for the fact that they've issued, I haven't shown you their well-meaning statement on this issue, but for the fact that they have been making these statements on these issues and yet selling All Lives Matter merchandise in their stores. And they made a decision just announced this morning that they're going to stop doing that. So they responded to that criticism. Walmart also got some attention for declaring that they won't, in their Mississippi stores, allow the Mississippi state flag to be displayed or part of merchandising in their stores. So a case of being responsive. Here's an interesting example of where the potential conflict, let's not call it hypocrisy, let's just call it conflict between corporate words and deeds, just really gets lived out right there on the shop floor, so to speak, or the grocery store floor. This is in Massachusetts, where some employees wanted to wear Black Lives Matter brand, masks while working in masks at the store. And as you see in their take on it, their message, their charge is that Whole Foods cares about the business their racist customers give them, in their words, more than spreading a peaceful yet important message. Whole Foods' response, well, we have longstanding company appearance policies which say no visible slogans, no messages, no logos, no advertising that are not related to the company itself. So sorry, we're going to shut this down. Now, that kind of an interesting defining moment, I think. The policy is there, fine. They're shutting down this employee expression is consistent with their policy. But it's an important moment for the company to think about what they really believe in, what their values really are, and how they want to implement that in their corporate policies. And I want to mention an argument made by this fellow, Eric Levitz, writing in New York Magazine last week, a few weeks ago, because this whole idea that we can call out corporations for being inconsistent, or if you want to be harsh, hypocritical about their words and their deeds. And a lot of that has to do with, the diversity of their workplace, their promotion policies, the diversity of their executive suite, their boardroom, other aspects of corporate policies. This fellow Levitz in New York is making a much broader point about the inconsistency, as he says here, between pledging allegiance to Black Lives Matter at the same time that you actually engage in policies in terms of lobbying that actually exacerbate the racial wealth gap and other relevant issues through the choices you make, the tax policies that you choose to advocate in your Washington and State House lobbying, and other aspects of your government relations program. And that's a larger, bigger issue than just, okay, let's look at the diversity of your workforce while you're pledging your allegiance to the Black Lives Matter cause. And I think that this is a broader, very interesting argument that's worth engaging, and is, in my opinion, isn't being engaged enough. I'll skip that slide. Lastly, yeah, because I only want to talk for a few more minutes, maybe take a couple of questions. And by the way, if you have questions, you can write them in the chat, or you can probably just talk when Ishan opens it up for questions. Lastly, what firms do? I'm going to just sort of pick out a company and a CEO, and I'm not doing this to shame them or anything. I just think it's a representative example, and it's a good one, and it's a relevant one for our school and our city, because this fellow, Seth Bernstein, is the CEO of Alliance Bernstein, which, as many of you know, is relocating their headquarters from New York to Nashville as we speak. They're sort of in the middle of that process. And so they released this story on the screen is from our local business paper, the Nashville Business Journal. And they released a list of, it took the form of a all hands message to his workforce on their intended tangible actions, as it says there at the bottom. So here's the memo addressed to fellow colleagues. I think that's redundant, but be that as it may. All hands memo, and let me blow up. There were three big categories of things they say they're going to do. And let's just blow them up so you can perhaps read them more easily. And the first category is about organizational change. The first bullet under there, we're going to find us a Black board member. And the second is we're going to retain a diversity talent partner, and we're going to prioritize issues of attracting minority talent and cultivating and feedback and development and promoting. It's all good stuff, if perhaps a bit boilerplate, but certainly good stuff. You want companies doing this, and perhaps rather than not doing it. And you see at the bottom there, fostering awareness with educational resources, training, anti-racism, bystander training, that sort of thing. Okay, the second part is a little more abstruse and hard to understand, where they talk about how they want to engage in investment platform alignment. That's a phrase that I really have no idea what it means. They want to leverage the strength of their platform and standing in their communities to promote racial justice and socioeconomic development. You can see there's some bullets under there involving how they work with their clients. Also good stuff, if extremely vague compared to the first set. But this is fine. This is fairly typical, and I think this is what a lot of firms are doing. I think they're being called on the carpet for being vague, and like, there's legitimate questions about whether they're establishing true metrics for whether they achieve these things. But I think it's just a sort of a typical example. Now, another thing that companies are doing that's maybe not so typical, but is getting noticed and firms are getting called out for, is this idea of how they're handling pay, and especially executive pay. And this is more about coronavirus than about racial justice, in the sense that the dire economic consequences of coronavirus would have led a lot of firms to be on the brink of bankruptcy. And here you see this story about some boards handing out lots of money. Hertz, which is approaching or in bankruptcy, is one of the firms that did this, basically rewarding top executives while screwing pretty much everybody else, as a result of perhaps circumstances that are partially beyond their control, but nonetheless creating certainty, as this shareholder advocate fellow says, creating certainty for top executives while the employee base is experiencing the greatest possible uncertainty. This was a particular story from early June about the defense contractor Raytheon Technologies, which is not a firm going bankrupt, but that has basically made all of its workers take a 10% pay cut while reconfiguring the pay package that its chief executive earns, that will increase his future income by large amounts of money. I want to mention lastly what's going on with Facebook, and it's a little bit of an abrupt shift because it's a somewhat of a different thing, but I'm sure many of you have noticed this and are following it. This has really been dominating the news. I mean, Facebook and its troubles have been all over the news for months, if not years. But this particular aspect of it has been heavy in the press over the last week or two, around their policies for whether or not they're going to do a different or better job of managing, governing hate speech on their platform and disinformation. Certainly the political season we're in has something to do with this. But because they've been somewhat stubbornly refusing to really up their game in terms of reviewing and potentially policing and hate speech, a movement, this hashtag Stop Hate for Profit movement, has arisen, leading brands, big brands, to announce, as the headline says, a temporary boycott. This is the webpage of the Stop Hate for Profit movement, if you will. You can see we're asking businesses to stand in solidarity and to not advertise. That's the boycott nature, to not use Facebook services for advertising during the month of July. And a lot of major corporations have signed on to this. I think what is interesting, let me hold off on that slide. What's interesting about this is that it's a case, policing firms and their moral behavior and trying to get consumers to address this is certainly nothing new. There have been interest groups and nonprofits that have been doing that, trying to pressure businesses, perhaps to not advertise in certain places, pressure consumers to boycott businesses. This is interesting because this is business to business, right? This involves large corporations essentially joining together to boycott another large corporation in terms of withholding their advertising services. This has certainly gotten Facebook's attention. This news story is from just over the weekend. On Friday, Facebook, now the headline says, bowing to pressure, will start labeling violating posts from politicians. This seen specifically as a response to this little movement that's taken hold over the last few weeks. You see that second paragraph there. The move amounts to major concessions amid public pressure, employee unrest, and the burgeoning advertiser boycott. Now, it turns out that advertisers are not satisfied with that, because the move that Facebook made on Friday in response is from the standpoint of the Stop Hate for Profit folks, is inadequate, is limited, and a good start, but only that. And so we are starting to see more and more. I think I saw in the news this morning that I want to say Pepsi signed on yesterday as another company that's going to boycott Facebook advertising. And by the way, it's, and this is kind of a note to close on. It's not just businesses, it's others who use Facebook. I was quite interested to notice this tweet from Sleeping Giants, the watchdog group, noticing that Emory's Business School has joined the Stop Hate for Profit campaign. Business schools use social media platforms like Facebook to advertise their programs, and Emory's Business School has joined the campaign and has announced it will suspend paid advertising on Facebook during the month of July. So there we are, and I'm going to end there and invite questions. I will just say in closing that I've just sort of been rambling around a bunch of different thoughts. The title of my talk was how the ethics of business are affected by these crises, and there's certainly a view of ethics that says, well, the answer should be not at all. Ethics are stable, and your ethics are your ethics, whether in times of crisis or not. But clearly, in the practical and applied world of decision making and policy making by corporations that we think of as the world of business ethics, these crises bring on new dilemmas, new situations, new choices that have to be made. And I think it's a really fascinating set of them. The ones I've talked about in this brief discussion only scratch the surface of what's a much broader universe of possible issues that we could talk about. So I will stop there and end my dog and pony and invite your questions. And I'm going to look over to the chat, and I see Dave Goodrich asks 2 questions. Can you share the most conservative and the most liberal states when it comes to free expression, and where does Tennessee fit into the mix? Well, because I assume, Dave, you're referring to the fact that I said that a lot of employment law and a lot of law around free expression, what's legally allowable, varies from state to state, and I assume that's probably the intention of the question. There's a broader notion that civil libertarians call lifestyle discrimination, the idea of companies, employers who have the right or don't to govern or control employee activities off work generally, which could be speech or it could be other kinds of activities. And some states have, to answer Dave's question, some states have very broad lifestyle discrimination statutes that bar employers from policing the off-work behavior of their employees, from firing somebody for legal off-work activity. There's actually only 4 states that have very big, widespread protections. And here's a little quiz for you. I don't have a Zoom quiz. It's just a quiz for you to think about. And I invite guesses in the chat for the next minute or two. The 4 states that have the most sort of comprehensive protections preventing employers from sanctioning their workers for lifestyle choices they make, actions they do outside of work. Those 4 are, I'm going to tell you 3 of them: New York, Massachusetts, California, and I invite your guesses of the 4th. New York, Massachusetts, California, what's the 4th? Anyone wants to type in the chat? I see Alabama, Connecticut, Hawaii. Oh, Hawaii was a private guess. Very good. Vermont. The answer is North Dakota, oddly enough. The other thing I want to say is that while only a few states have these very broad protections for this notion of lifestyle discrimination, there are some other states that have narrower protections. For example, California protects, Louisiana maybe is a better example. Louisiana has a state law protection against an employer punishing you for your political activity. That's an example of a state where maybe that person getting fired for a bumper sticker on their car, a political bumper sticker, it might not have been legally acceptable or valid in Louisiana. And there are a few states that have specific protections around certain kinds of political activity, and that even private sector employers can't penalize you for that. But you can imagine all the vagueness that comes with that. What's political activity? If I show up at a Black Lives Matter protest downtown, and my employer doesn't like that for some reason, and the local TV station is, covering it for the 10 o'clock news, and there I am, caught on camera, and my boss calls me in and says, "I saw you on TV last night. You're fired for that." If I live in a state with protections for political activity, are we going to get into an argument about whether my actions are affected or covered by that? And all of these laws allow employers to always make a case that even if your speech is in theory protected, your speech disrupts my business. And ultimately, that's a dispute you would have in front of a judge and a jury if it comes to a court case. There's a question from a corporate viewpoint. How do you think about the ethics of not saying anything at all about these crises? Ranga, do you mean the ethics of employer? I assume you mean, corporate viewpoint. You mean of companies choosing to stay silent?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, I'm going to be a little cynical here. I already was cynical on this subject earlier in the talk. I personally find so many of these corporate messages, while well-meaning, of course, I just find them to be sort of cloying. And so for me personally, I sometimes feel silence might be the better part of valor. But I do get the fact that probably many firms think that silence risks being interpreted as utter indifference. For a cynic like me, speaking in a perfunctory way that says very little and shows that your message was basically crafted by your PR department, to me that conveys and signals indifference as well. So I think I look to the meaningfulness of the words and the message and what kind of context they're trying to put it in. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm not going to say it's unethical to remain silent. I don't think any of us has a moral obligation to speak on these matters. Companies certainly incur some kind of obligation to do something. You want to follow up, Ron? Go ahead.
No, I'm just going to, sorry to interrupt here, but I just wondered maybe a different way for me to ask the question is, have you seen any companies that you think are doing it well? Since it's laced with cynicism, some of your interpretations.
I'm not cynical about the effort. Somebody threw Ben and Jerry's in the chat window, I think, in response to that question, and I have seen some of their messaging that was, if nothing else, more direct and intense. Stephanie Jones, do you want to unmute yourself and tell us why you think Ben and Jerry's is
Sure.
doing it well?
So one of the things that I've seen in response to Ben and Jerry's, twofold actually. One, consumers are very happy about the response. So the people that have been very passionate about this have been very happy about the response, and they feel like they're actually doing things to make an effort to do that. Two, they've been very explicit in exactly what they're doing, versus the blanket statement, Bruce, that you put up earlier, insert brand name here. They've been very specific about what they want to see changed, what they are doing in order to actually affect that change. Because one of the criticisms that people are facing is that they're saying, oh, I donated to Black Lives Matter or these different groups, but they're not actually doing anything within their companies to address diversity issues or things like that. And so Ben & Jerry's has been very explicit about what they're planning on doing, how they're sort of planning on influencing that. And to be honest, just from a marketing brand perspective, they're doing it all within their brand, which I think just from an outside like marketing perspective is also really good.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And you know, thinking about two of the examples that I did mention in my talk here, put side by side Warby Parker there, which I had that Instagram post, and Alliance Bernstein and that all hands message from the CEO. And you know, I think that Warby Parker, their message looked, I think, like what Stephanie was just saying was, you know, what people get cynical about, in the sense that it said, okay, we're going to give a boatload of money or some amount of money. It may not be a boatload. We're going to give a sum of money to some groups, and then we're going to do some stuff internally, but we're going to tell you later about that. As opposed to, I guess, Alliance Bernstein that said, look, here's what we're actually going to try to do with respect to the diversity of our board. And by the way, when I first read that Warby Parker letter, you know, point number one, we're going to find a Black person for the board. I mean, I had a very cynical response to it, because it just seemed like such an important yes, but also kind of small instrumental goal to set. But then before I let my cynicism run away from myself, I thought to myself, well, let's look at what their board looks like presently. And I went, and Warby Parker, I guess, pretty closely held company, very small board. Their entire corporate board of directors is only 7 people. So actually, that's a non-trivial diversification of their very small board, to make that addition, and other specific steps. I think that's a good point. A question from Emily. What are the ethics of requiring or even encouraging employees to return to face work COVID when that work can be done remotely? For example, encouraging office workers to return to the office because it's more effective for the firm. Great question. And by the way, with respect to COVID, you know, more of my examples around employee speech during this talk were about race and BLM and racial justice. But there are a lot of obviously cases and issues involving employees pushing back against their employers for their COVID-related policies, exactly of the type that Emily has mentioned here. The ethics of, and I didn't work this into the talk, and I should have. Firms have a lot to think about, not just in terms of these short-term decisions they might make about, such as the example Emily used, are you going to sort of force people to come back to work when they think it's not safe to do so? You know, the ethics of that are that it's clearly a very weighty moral decision because actual harm to humans is at stake. But COVID is also implicated. You know, I showed you that slide, the argument by the writer in New York Magazine, talking from a race perspective about the idea that firms, through their government relations policies, the way the public policies they lobby for, have exacerbated, he argues, economic inequality and racial injustice. That's a point we could debate another time. But there's a COVID side to that as well. The extent to which firms have used their government relations arms and their lobbying efforts to lobby for the kinds or against the kinds of public policies that would really make a difference in this COVID and post-COVID return to work era, having to do with the availability of affordable childcare, the availability of health insurance outside of employment, the availability, the requirement that employers provide paid time off, which has been implemented in some cities and maybe a few states, but is not widely available in this country, even though, of course, it's a feature of labor relations in virtually every other advanced economy in the world. And to what extent are employers implicated in the sort of deficit of public policies that would make Emily's question perhaps less acute and urgent than it is. I'm watching the time. We got a few more minutes. Mark, you responded to Emily. Isn't the issue also met of racial justice to the extent that minority employees are more likely to take public transportation rather than drive their own cars? Yes, I mean, of course. And so much of the effects of COVID have been disparate in terms of their effects on communities of color, on economic sectors, people who work in certain industries versus others, and those industries more dominated by people of color, by people of more limited means. Absolutely, the intersection between COVID and racial justice is widespread and clear. Other questions? I think I've exhausted the chat box. It's a small enough group that if somebody just wanted to unmute and jump in, you're welcome to do so. Well, I guess maybe we're done then. Ishan, over to you.